It says before you pivot.
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, as Nick alluded to in his prefacing remarks, pivot along with uncertain times and unprecedented seem to be the buzzwords of choice. And so I think there's a series of considerations that you need to make before you actually execute on quote unquote pivoting. So we'll talk about that. But first, as foreshadowing, we have a few default assumptions that we make, which is that you started your business for a specific reason. And the reason doesn't necessarily matter. I mean, from a judgmental perspective, like the reason could be you want to be wealthy, or the reason could be that you want to redefine an industry, or the reason might be that you have some tangible thing you want to buy. It doesn't necessarily matter to me because it's preference, and preference is inherently relative. And so it doesn't matter to me what your reason is or reasons. But what does matter is that you don't lose sight of those and start chasing your tail or chasing shiny objects. Because frankly, there's unintended consequences. And that's so much about what my book, Seeking Certainty, that my head is in the clouds right now on, because I'm in kind of rewrite mode. And so my focus keeps coming back to that. And the chapter I'm working on right now is about just unintended consequences and how we start chasing after something and not realizing that it's actually getting us farther away from the specific reason, or what I call profit priorities. So my assumption is that every action that you're taking with respect to your business is getting you closer to what those priorities are. Like that's your preference, is that you want to take actions to get you closer, not further away. And part of that is really eliminating financial anxiety. It's hard to execute on your action steps when you're fraught with anxiety. So those are the assumptions that I work from, and Nick works from as well. And it largely is kind of the underpinning of everything that we talk about, which is basically, what is the point? You're doing all this stuff and it's getting you further away from what you want. Truly, what is the point? Why are you doing it? And so with that, let's just talk about what it is. What is a pivot? And frankly, there's really no consensus on the definition of it. When I think about pivot, where my mind goes to is startup community. And because it's very, very common for startup businesses to pivot. And there's some crazy statistic on about the percentage of startup businesses that pivot. And oftentimes in the quote unquote startup is that they're doing something innovative. And inherently, in part of doing something innovative, if you've heard us talk about the diffusion of innovation curve, there's going to be pivots as you get more data. And as you move in from innovators to early adopters to early and late majority, there's different needs that and wants that as you move across the diffusion curve. So it's almost inherent, if you're starting from a position of innovation, that there will be changes, tweaks. So as it relates to pivot, some consider a pivot a dramatic fundamental change in business strategy. We're inverting, we're going in the exact opposite direction, or we're moving to an entirely different vertical. But other folks would consider a mild shifts in strategy to be the equivalent of pivots. And then if you do any Google searches and you read the range of articles that are out there, others would include like spinning off a product, using different technologies for existing products, focusing on additional verticals. So things that are additive to be reflective of a pivot. And so that just creates a lot of think confusion when there's not a consistent use of a term. So you hear pivot and you have one interpretation and somebody else has another. Nick, anything you want to add on to that?
I think that's one of the biggest problems in general. I can easily say, hey, you know what, Dan, I think we should make a small pivot. And you go, yeah, I totally agree. And there's the illusion that we have just communicated effectively, when in reality, we could be talking about two very, very different things. And so anytime there's no consensus definition, I'm a pain in the ass when I talk to people about that, about stuff like this, because there's the risk of even your business coach, somebody you trust, somebody that has a ton of wisdom, saying, you probably need to pivot a little bit. They may be talking about very, very minor change. And if that's not clarified, you're at risk of doing something drastic and dangerous. So that just the definition and the precision in the language, I think, is super, super important to highlight.
Yeah, I think it in a way it's become this like glorified thing. I'm pivoting, and that's like somehow reflective of some like great business strategist. Like, hey, I uncovered this thing that I'm going to pivot to, and here's all the reasons why, and this is why it's going to work. And it's probably a pretty I think in the internet marketing world, this is great, like dopamine hit. I was doing X, but now I just discovered Y, and that's going to be awesome. But in venture-backed businesses, the idea of a pivot is with a lot of consideration and consternation, because the investors bought into one idea and now we're shifting to something else. Is that idea fully baked? So as it usually occurs, Nick and I were having a conversation this morning, and I was asking him what things he wanted to include, if any, into this training. And I was reflecting on like some of the things I saw in the internet marketing world, and what I kept coming back to is this: that oftentimes when people are pivoting, it's like, hey, we've got one kid, and turns out like this kid is really misbehaving, and we don't know what to do. We don't know what to do about it, and we're not getting much sleep. And I thought this was going to be easier, and our marriage is like suffering as a result of it. And what would be a great idea is if we should actually that would solve all of our problems, is we should just have another kid and adopt a puppy. Mm-hmm. That's gonna solve everything. One kid is struggling, and it's impacting our happiness in our marriage. So we can save the marriage by having another kid. And so when you say it like that, if someone said to you, a friend, hey, I think the best thing for us to do right now to like save our marriage, or to sort of help me deal with a kid that I'm struggling with, is to have a second kid, and then also do something entirely different and get a dog. You'd be like, hey, maybe we should hold off on that. Like, maybe we can kind of figure out, like, let's get the current state of affairs under control before we introduce more craziness to the equation. Would probably be the feedback that you give. And I just mentioned that because that's what I think a lot of folks are doing with their whole pivots, is that, hey, business one is struggling, or product one is struggling. So what I should do is actually launch another product. And that other product should actually be in a totally different industry, which is sort of the puppy analogy. Because not only is it a new product, but it's also something entirely different that we don't have a whole lot of data on. Maybe we don't have any experience on, but let's just go ahead and try to solve the problem by adding more complexity. Nick, anything you want to add on to that?
I think the people that live in the marketing frame in a business context are at the highest risk, because solving the problem is tough, right? It's kind of a gut check too. You want to open, again, trying to save the marriage, you want to open another business because you can't figure out how to do this one. Sometimes we hide from that. And I'm just, again, gut check. Sometimes Dan and I do that. Sometimes we hide from the fact that we are inadequate at solving this particular problem. And instead of putting the resources into solving this particular problem, or figuring out if maybe we should get out of this particular problem. We just start something new, and then we convince ourselves that it's a win because it's something new. And I know people, they get in this trap all the time. So just being aware of, are you trying to save the marriage? It's really easy to launch a new thing, sell 5 people, consider it a win. And again, it just added more complexity, got you further away from the thing. So some people are at risk because actually, doing the work that would save the marriage is it's too hard. So do the other thing. And we at least need to be aware that we're making that decision, I think.
That's right. So with that, let's kind of just dovetail into the steps. So before you pivot, step number 1 is let's understand our current financial position. And so I've added some color on what I mean by that. One is how much liquidity do you have? So liquidity would be looking at your assets relative to your liabilities, and then how much of those assets, how much is in cash or cash equivalent. And within that sort of category of cash is looking at our reserves. So I'm going to stop the share for a second and bring up something from revenue multiplier. So give me a moment here, Nick.
Yep. There's a question here. It says, is part of the problem a huge focus on revenue? So adding might be likely to bring more revenue, but not necessarily profit. Yes, we hammer that hard in cash flow engineering and the revenue multiplier. It's the marketer frame Dan always talks about. It is very likely that all the things you're doing to add revenue, one, there's dopamine hits. It feels like new stuff, new business, so it feels like a win. It's very likely that it's getting you further away from your goals. It could, and putting you at a higher risk. So risk adjusted, you're at a worse place the more revenue you add. It seems super counterintuitive, but it's likely, especially if you imagine you launch a new product every week to just generate revenue, the amount of complexity, fulfillment, HR, all that stuff could very well bury you. So heavy focus on revenue, which Dan calls the marketer frame, is absolutely a risk.
Yeah, just to plus what you just said as well, Nick. And we talked about this, I think, last week in the 7 steps to cash. If you need cash now, introducing a new product that's on the diffusion curve, going to be focused on innovators or focused on early adopters, what we know from all the data, 60 plus years of research and 4,000 plus academic articles, is that those are not typically profitable offers. It's not until we move to early majority and late majority where the market share moves to the potential market share that's been captured moves to more like 50%. That's when the opportunity for profit really steps in. And so folks then will say, well, Dan, I launched a product that was innovative because of the way that we delivered the solution was new, and we made money on it. And that's typically because you invested your time.
Yep.
You're not attributing a cost to your time. So maybe you made $100,000, but what was the cost, the opportunity cost that you gave up in hustling to put this together relative to your other opportunities? So it may have been profitable on a revenue minus expense basis because it doesn't factor in your cost to actually develop and deploy it. And that when you then try to scale it out, you're scaling from an innovator or early adopter phase, it's unlikely to be profitable at that stage. So often you see folks like, now I'm going to scale it out, and they wonder why it's not profitable. Well, that's because based off where you're at in the innovation curve, the economics that you were looking at weren't really accurate because you didn't include your costs, your time. So I hope that answered your question, Ben, but let us know if you have any follow-ups. So just wanted to pull up the revenue multiplier workbook once again. And if you haven't seen this, basically what we do is we pull on all of our revenue streams, what's the income type, cash flow, so on and so forth. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that. But then over here, we look at our reserves. And we're advocates for developing some algorithms, some rules for how much you want to hold in reserve for payroll, operating expenses, and then investment. And so what we're doing is we're putting in a percentage, how much of our reserve is funded, 80%, 95%, 0%. And it's giving you a reserve score, which is out of 100. And the idea is that to the extent to which your reserves are not fully funded, especially if your investment reserve isn't fully funded, are you really in an adequate position currently to be doing new stuff? Probably not. At least not new stuff that's in the innovation or early adopter phase. You need an offer that's probably in the late majority. So the market is well defined, the need is well defined. Like there's problem awareness, there's solution awareness, and therefore you have the potential to be able to bring in some cash that's profitable right away, because you're not having to build solution awareness along with problem awareness. Let me bring up the slides back up though.
Yeah, there we go.
So we want to understand our liquidity. How much do we have in cash? What are our liabilities? We'll understand our reserves, which is kind of a subset of liquidity. How much of them are funded, because do we really have the capital to be investing in new stuff? We think we're actually trying to improve our situation, but if we don't have the reserves to make those bets, that may be a fatal move or getting us further away from our objectives. Understanding our run rate, which is basically how much cash do we burn on a weekly basis. Usually I'd say monthly, but in a state of uncertainty we're in right now, understanding your weekly run rate is critical. In other words, how quickly are you going to burn through your cash if you don't get to break even? And then downside risks, and those are short-term and long-term downside risks. And we've talked a lot about this in almost all of our calls. So I'm not going to bore you to death on expanding on downside risks at this point. So understand our current financial position. Then we want to understand your position in the market. So what is your market share? So how much do you really own of this market? Is it 1%? Is it 20%? Is it 50%? Is it imperceptible amount? And this could be market share on a local basis, or this could be market share nationally, depending on what your offer is. The relevancy here is that if you're in a well-defined market and you own very little of it, then we move to the next piece, which is how are you competing? And man, Nick, this is like the thing that outside of the diffusion curve from a marketing perspective, this is probably the second biggest miss that I see. So 3 C's, this is how you can compete. You can compete based off convenience. You can compete based off competence, and you can compete based off cost. It's very difficult to compete on all 3, like effectively impossible, unless you control all the market share to compete on all 3. Amazon can do it. They control on several levels, right? The market, huge brand awareness, so on and so forth. But very difficult to go into a market where you're going to try and compete on all of them. So the conventional wisdom is that you pick one and you become world-class at that one thing. And then you build up your market share. And then you determine if you want to launch a new product in that same vertical where you're going to compete on something else. So if you look at the large brands, like pick a Johnson & Johnson or Procter & Gamble, right, where they have products that are in a really well-defined market, right? Maybe it's in the laggard stage, like 100% of the market has been consumed for soaps and shampoos and so on and so forth. And so what do? They maintain their current brand, and then they launch a entirely new brand that maybe it's produced at the same facility, but it competes at something different, right? So maybe they've got a product that is very low cost. So they've got a brand that's all low cost, and then they launch another brand that's somewhat competing, but not really, because they're going after people who want a premium product, and so therefore they're competing more at competence. This is a premium product that has some extra stuff to it. And so rather than trying to take the existing brand and flip it into, move it to competing at one of the other C's, they launch a new brand, which is an example, depending on your definition of a pivot. But how do you compete, and where are your offers on the diffusion curve? So are we innovators, early adopters, so on and so forth? And the relevance of this, and I guess will probably be repetitive, but the relevance here is if you've got low market share, but you're disaggregated in how you're competing and where you're at on the diffusion curve, then the simplest solution would be to not launch something entirely new. It would be to get clarity on how you're going to compete and realigning your message to be a fit with where we're at on the diffusion curve. That's where the easy money, maybe not easy money, but that's where the easy money is. You already have an existing product. It's maybe operationally, it's relatively built out, so on and so forth. You're just trying to compete on too many different playing fields, and that you have a mismatch in your offer relative to the diffusion curve. And so our tendency is then, let's launch something else. But in fact, we just need to get clarity and refine where we're at currently. Nick, anything you want to add on to that?
No, I think the Johnson & Johnson was a great example. If you want to just look at one company, I always defer to whatever technology is kind of in. Tesla is an example, right? The Model S was not competing on cost, but it's the Model 3s and the subsequent models moving into that space. So you can always see the movers and shakers. If you follow them, you could see them move along the diffusion curve and how they're competing, and which of the 3 C's they're trying to capture at any particular stage, if they choose to take more of the market.
Yeah, some brands like a Mercedes or BMW is just going to compete on being the best, right? They're not necessarily going to add in a lower cost option, but Tesla is not necessarily competing on being in the best auto manufacturer. They're competing on energy.
Yep.
So they've got a totally different play, long-term play. All right, step 3 is understand the future of the market. Has it or will it be disrupted? So where are you at in the market cycle? Is this, in other words, how mature is the market? How much has been captured thus far? And where is your product in its life cycle? So markets, the economy goes in cycles, products have a life cycle, consumers have a buying cycle, so on and so forth. So where are we at in these various cycles, and where are our competitors? And the relevance of this, again, is if you have an accounting firm, just as an example, because I have one, we're in a mature market. Most of our products are very mature. The competitor landscape is fairly well defined. There are some really big players, and there are a ton of small players. And the way in which small players become big players is mapped out already. It's through acquisition of other firms. That's the way, that's the path. This is all defined. And so because it's a mature market and a mature offer. So in the state of uncertainty, now would not be the time to do something totally different with a CPA firm, where you're just doing a 180 on your offer, because it's in a mature market. And so the move then becomes, how do you acquire audience, or how do you acquire your competitors? It's already defined because of the state of the market. If you're in a market that's not mature, because it's innovator or early adopter, or the product is fairly immature in the sense that there's not broad awareness of either the problem or broad awareness that you have the solution. Then you have a different series of questions to answer about what is the timeline for when we expect the market to mature, and given that timeline, what's our liquidity position, reserve, so on and so forth. Can we buy time in our run rate? Are we going to be able to survive when this market kind of becomes more mature and we can expect profitability at that point? All that said, though, if you are anticipating, so using like bookkeeping as an example, I'm anticipating major disruption in that space in the next 5 years. And so given that, the moves that you're going to make if you're anticipating major disruption, again, are different. That either could be plotting your exit so that you're getting out early, or it could be strategic partnerships, or it could be investment in technology so that you're the disruptor. But getting clarity on the future of the market, again, is critical before you actually start executing on these shifts. Nick, anything that you want to add on to that?
No, I think it's well said. I think people spend too much time. I'll say this just because we spend so much time. Again, it goes back to acquisition where who's our avatar? Who are we going to sell today? Who are we going to sell tomorrow? I don't think a lot of people know where they're at in the market cycle or the product life cycle. And it's a useful exercise to map these things out.
All right. So step 4, determine your existing assets, or determine your assets that are existing, hidden, and or partnerships that you have. So in CFE, we go through this process after you've analyzed, or we move into strategy, and we're determining what are assets that we can, based off relationships that are in place, expenses that we're already incurring, so on and so forth, that we can leverage and develop into something new. One of the things that Nick does regularly is he goes back and he looks at his list of stuff and says, what can I bundle together? Rather than creating something new in terms of a new product, based off what the needs are of the consumers currently. So right now we're really at the bottom of the pyramid. Like, folks really need basic needs, solutions, essentials, cash now. Access to food and shelter and so on and so forth. That's where the biggest market need is currently, right? Where people are really spending monies on basic needs. Well, what existing assets do we already have laying around that we could package together to make an offer? And so those are existing assets that are available that can be repackaged, or they're hidden in the sense that you have these existing relationships that can be leveraged. So they have something that your consumer wants, your customer wants, and you have something that combined becomes the total solution. For example, I mean, maybe you could talk about the profit flywheel. Nick, so you've got a couple of things and I've got a couple of things.
Yeah. So I'm really excited to announce all of this once I get it sorted out. Between what we've built is Customers for Life, my other company. And then obviously we have cash flow engineering and revenue multiplication. And the idea is it's a profit flywheel, which means if you can engineer cash flow and then get a whole bunch of clients and then make a tiny pivot or add a stream of revenue and repeat the process, you should be able to accumulate wealth. I don't want to say on demand because it's always unknown. But by laying that out, it allows us to zoom in and zoom out. There's certain times in the market, just in the state of the internet, there are certain times where it'll make a lot more sense to talk about the profit flywheel, wealth acceleration, especially when things are good, and there's other times like right now we're zooming way in and again, looking at the assets, looking at things that maybe we didn't consider assets before, and partnerships. The profit flywheel is a great example of all these things, actually. We could zoom in and say, hey, look, people aren't right now thinking about accelerating their wealth. They're thinking about staying alive. So let's take this flywheel, zoom in, and pull out the components that are going to help people stay alive right now. And that's the process. It's most of what we're doing all the time is within that profit flywheel, determining our existing assets, because there's so much stuff that maybe was not in demand or popular or appropriate 6 months ago laying around that is perfect for right now. And so the way we build things is so that we can zoom in, zoom out. But it's a combination of existing assets, hidden assets, and partnerships that really makes it work.
Right. So in that profit flywheel, you have two things. You have the customers for life, and you have the cash now. And then I have two things, which are the CFE and the revenue multiplier. And then we pull them together and create this product that becomes the total solution, right? So that's an example of leveraging a partnership. And so we're not building anything new. It's already existing. We're just packaging it together. So want to determine our existing assets and then understand our existing audience. So I have geography, but I don't necessarily mean the physical location, although that could be important. But I mean geography in the sense of where do you access them? So Nick, you have this audience audit process where you look at how much do you have, what's your audience like via email? What is your audience like via Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, etc.? Maybe you can, I'll just put you on the spot and maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's it's really important to understand your existing audience. It's why we do this for a few reasons. One, so you know where to spend your time, and two, so you know so you know how to communicate with them, and three, we need to understand, and I don't know, this may not be the most appropriate, but if we're going to talk about pivoting, I think it is. We need to understand who owns the audience. Right? It's very, very possible that your entire audience is Instagram and you do really, really well. They love you on Instagram lives or stories.
Yeah.
And we're planning a pivot and we're going to push all of our audience to our new thing. And Instagram decides it doesn't want to do stories anymore. Right? It's high risk if you don't understand the nature of where your audience is hanging out and how you're talking to them. So the whole, I think it's really important to understand the geography and where your true fans are. Otherwise, you're at risk. So again, my private clients and people, I'm going to build it into customers for life as well. We need to understand at all times the nature of where we might, oh yeah, I got a bunch of Instagram followers. We really need to understand the nature of Instagram and the nature of how they consume and where they're at on the diffusion curve. And especially if they're true fans, how do they talk about you? All those things are really important to understand.
Yeah. So I go sort of step one, where are they at? So, and how many? So we've got folks who are on Instagram and maybe we've got 50,000 followers on Instagram. And then we go to Facebook and we've got 20,000. And then we got 100,000 people on email. Well, turns out we have 7 true fans. All right. So true fan by my definition is essentially the person who is your kind of people and who are going to buy. If you make an offer, they're going to buy it because they just believe in what you're doing and they're diehards basically. And I'm watching the Jordan documentary, right? And I grew up like with Jordan, like most kids my age, at least, Jordan being like my idol. And so I watch the documentary and I hear him say something and I was like, what do you think about that? How do you think he's coming across? And I'm like, I'm such a big fan that I'm so biased on like whatever he says. I just interpret it in a positive way and I dismiss like the negatives. It's like, oh, that's just who he is. I'm a true fan. And so I'm pretty much buying whatever he's selling in proverbial sense, not the literal sense. He's selling his narrative, and I'm buying it every time because I'm a quote unquote true fan. So getting clarity on how many true fans you actually have, because folks get really caught up in the size of their audience. And you can test this to a degree because, and talk about this on the next slide, but by taking micro steps. So if you don't know how many true fans you have, then put out some really soft offers to those audiences and see what your response rate is. Get them to take a micro step, whether that's to click on something that you have pixeled, or getting them to opt in to an email list, so on and so forth. So you can just measure the size, the actual size of your true fans from Instagram, so on and so forth. Because the danger is that you spend a lot of time plotting out this pivot, and then you put out a launch and there's nothing. And you're like, I don't understand why I have so many folks who follow me. Well, maybe they liked some of the cat pictures. Like you put some cat pics up, and they're not really your fan. They just like the stuff that the images that you're sharing that actually don't really have anything to do with you. They just like that content, but they're not necessarily primed to buy something from you or take a micro step. Nick, did you have something you want to add to that?
I'll see the next slide, but I'll give you an example why Customers for Life exists and how it exists. Is basically went to the audience. I said, hey, I made a little landing page. Said, I'm going to do something and it's going to cost money. Do you want to be on the wait list? Name, phone number, email, all mandatory. The size of that list validated to me that it should launch it, and sure enough, almost everybody on there bought it. So that's an example of just a micro step that helps identify, true fans versus people that are just lurking.
Yep, great, thanks. The diffusion curve piece is just understanding, are they innovators, early adopters, where are they at? Because if they're all laggards or late market and you're offering innovative solutions, you don't have any buyers. So trying to take some micro steps to figure that out as well. And then your champions list. And we have a whole workbook and revenue multiplier on how to build out your champions list. A champions list is kind of like true fans, but these are people who are advocates of yours that you have a real intimate relationship with, and who are willing to make introductions on your behalf. They're willing to tell people that you're awesome. And you have to assess, though, is their audience or their contacts the contacts that you need for your specific offer. So maybe Nick has a new product coming out, and I've got a lot of great connections, but for that specific product, none of my connections are relevant. So while I've got great connections, there's just no relevancy. So I can introduce him to a bunch of people who are all awesome, and but they're not going to move the needle for what he's trying to accomplish. So understanding our existing audience, and then we want to understand the on-ramps and off-ramps. So basically, this is where we're going to determine what are the micro steps that we can take. And is it floating a light offer out? Would anybody be interested in XYZ? And you float that out to your audience. And if you've never made an offer before, then the first offer that you make, and maybe the second and third offer that you make, is probably not actually an offer to something you're selling, because they don't have that relationship with you yet. It's kind of advancing the relationship too. And I think about things. This is the whole T-learning versus I-learning. I think about like the customer journey being equivalent to like dating and or getting married. It's like if your relationship with someone is they're a friend of a friend of a friend that you see every once in a while at a party, and so you get along, like you're friendly. They know your name. They know who you are. If you bumped into them on the street, they'd wave at you, and maybe you'd have a passing conversation. Potentially they might have to like struggle to recall your name, but they know who you are. And so if you ran into them on the street, it would probably be odd if you were like, hey, do you want to come to my wedding? Like, I don't really know you. This is odd. Or you make some broader like proposal. Why don't we move in together? Hey, I'm looking for a roommate. Why don't we move in together? It's like, I don't necessarily know you very well. Like, how about we do coffee first before we move in together? So that's just by way of analogy, you've got some audience of folks. It could be emails, it could be existing clients, so on and so forth. And so you're going from a very passive relationship to proposing to them. And then, and that's a big leap. So we want to take micro steps towards that in a way that's going to help us determine, are they true fans? Are they, and where are they at on the diffusion curve? If we could just bucket them through some micro steps to determine where they're at on the diffusion curve and if they're true fans, then that helps us determine whether we're going to have a fit with our offer to our existing audience. So if they're all innovators and my product is late majority, then there's probably a pretty good likelihood they're not going to buy it, even though they might be your kind of people. Some of them may just to support you. They're true fans. They want to support you out of obligation, perhaps, but it's not going to yield the type of results that you want. So determining the micro steps to bucketize them into the right categories, and then determining your trigger points. So what we'll do, and I'll use the CFE for Kids example again. 10 weeks ago, we put together an initial offer that I floated out. How many folks would be interested in if I put together like a kids financial literacy program? And we mapped out the trigger points about whether or not we're going to proceed. What's the first thing we're willing to do? Well, we're willing to put together a landing page so we can capture all the information. And then if we get X number of people on the landing page, then we're willing to do the next thing. The next thing is we're going to send out an email. And that email is going to be to a Google Doc with an offer. Why to a Google Doc? Because it takes a bunch of time to build out all these funnels. And so let's just see if anybody on this list, and there were like 1,000 people who ended up signing up on the list, would take a micro step to buy at a really low cost point. And so then we determined if there were, I think we said 25 people who purchased, then we would take the next step and build out the program. But we want to do it at a low enough price point, because if we got into it and it turned out that the amount of time that it was going to take to build it out, and that we couldn't upsell any folks to other offers or other programs, we were going to just refund them. And so we built out all of the trigger points to determine where's our on-ramp, when are we going to do more, but what's our off-ramp, when are we going to do less? And then the last step is to split your aces. So we're always looking to split our aces. And this is where the cognitive dissonance steps in. Is we've done all the work now. We figured out what our assets are and our current position. We've evaluated our existing market, because maybe we need to just play in that same arena and just tweak things. Or you know what? We do need to launch something different because the market's about to be disrupted, so on and so forth. But now we need to split our aces, which is effectively, let's not stop doing the main thing. So whatever the main thing is, whatever the existing revenue stream is, maybe that's diminished significantly. But if this was a profitable business before coronavirus, there's no reason to stop doing that thing, because it's likely to come back. And what's the data to suggest otherwise? Maybe there was something in step 5 or step 4 where you realize, hey, you know what? This has been a depreciating asset for a long time. But typically that's not the case. 8, 9, 99 out of 100 times, it's that you had a mismatch in your on the diffusion curve, and you had a mismatch on the 3 C's, and fixing that gets you back on track long term. There's always the industry specific issues of you're in restaurant or tourism and it's been wiped out, but it's going to come back. So we don't want to stop doing the main thing for the sake of the new thing. When Microsoft decided to pivot a few years back towards being more cloud-based, they did not stop selling Windows and Excel, Office, so on and so forth. It wasn't until they fully validated Office 365 and their Azure platform and all this other stuff, and that it had grown at a scale before they started transitioning their products to be all accessible online, and that then becomes their primary way of acquiring the technology. They didn't just move overnight, even though they had some dip in market share and where they're at on the diffusion curve, it shifted to perhaps late majority. They didn't just stop doing that. And we got an existing profitable business. It's moved in the product cycle, market cycle, where we can anticipate the profits are going to start to diminish and growth is going to diminish because we've captured almost all the market share. Let's not stop doing that. Let's split our aces and launch something new or different or tweak, depending on the research you've done in the previous steps, to complement or be additive. But we don't just stop doing the other thing. That's the biggest. If there's one thing that I would hope that you take away, is this idea that you always want to split your aces. And said another way, you can run more than one race. You don't have to stop the race that you're on currently to run the other one. It's possible that you can train and prepare for both. There's going to be some diminishing returns as a result, but we don't want to kind of, just to use several turns of phrase, we don't want to bite off our nose in spite of our face. Like, let's continue to maintain the other asset while we go through the other steps and get the product or service launched accordingly. So that's what I've got. Let's see what questions we have or anything you want to add, Nick.
Yeah, let's take questions. I got 9 minutes. I think we can get these two in. First one is, the question might be a bit broad, but are there certain signs you're looking for when assessing the likelihood of disruption in a market? Are you specifically looking for the products early in the innovation curve? And is there a way to hedge against those products which totally disrupt a market? I'll give mine. Dan probably has a better answer, more aligned with your question. I don't typically, this is me personally, not necessarily what I'm suggesting, I don't typically look at the market as much as the behavior of the people in the market, which means if the behavior starts changing, I might pay attention. But for me, anyway, looking at products early in the innovation curve, there's way too many that are way too unknown to have any idea. For me, like back of hand, thin slicing everything, to have any idea what I should focus on. Because if that was the case, I'd have to worry about all of them, because they all sound really good on paper and they all have brilliant, presentation decks and stuff like that. So the likelihood of disruption of the market, I'm looking at the way people are actually behaving in the market. Like when people start buying everything off Amazon, I start worrying about Amazon. So maybe not as concise of an answer, but that's, for me personally, that's what I'm looking at. I'm trying to stay super in tune to how people are actually behaving versus what, an innovative company says that they're doing.
My angle on this is additive to what Nick said, but first off, if you're going to focus heavily on the innovation curve, then you're likely in a position where you need to go raise external capital, because we know that the path to profitability is going to be pretty long. There's not product awareness, and there's not solution awareness. It's not necessarily need awareness per se. So you're potentially creating a new market, and that takes years for the market to mature. So if you're going to launch products that are early in the innovation curve, that's probably a scenario where you've got to go raise some external capital, or you need to bake into your investment reserves that the majority of your profits are going to go back into innovating this new set of products. So that would be first off. The other thing that I always go to is that we only innovate where we differentiate. And I think it's Steven Shapiro who said that. So we only innovate where we differentiate. So if you're developing a product and you view it as innovative, how does it actually play in the area where you're going to differentiate from your competitors or from existing solutions? So we need to be kind of crystal clear on that differentiation piece. Otherwise, you're building out some innovation that's probably not going to move the needle. If anything, the cost is going to be greater than the benefit. Businesses who, I've had some businesses who are, well, I have a lot of clients who are technology companies, and probably 50% conservatively want to write their own accounting software, because they're like, I don't really care for QuickBooks. It doesn't necessarily fit my needs, and I can just write some algorithms and solve all these problems. It's like, well, that's not, I don't think you're differentiating. You're a SaaS-based company. I'm pretty sure no one's hiring you because you're differentiating based off your internal accounting solution. So this is not where you should be spending your capital being time or money. In terms of how you hedge against other, hedge against those products, that's a much longer discussion, and hopefully you're part of the revenue engineering class, because we're moving into that part of our discussion about hedging.
Cool. We'll hit. I've been working on pivoting from a service-based model to a product-based model, and wondering what questions I should be asking, or if it's in fact the right spot on the innovation curve for me in the service. Provide tech strategies to scale existing processes with automation. It's been difficult to scale. Try different acquisition strategies. Haven't been able to meaningfully shorten the cycle. Feels like the only thing I haven't tried is building an audience. So I've been building some assets to do that for each mass market, yada, yada, yada. Upsell it to done-for-you versions and ascend into higher ticket services. Does this pivot sound reasonable? It sounds like I'm not sure what you're optimizing for. Because in the beginning here, and again, this is probably a longer conversation, we might run out of time. If you're pivoting from a service-based model to a product-based model, but you're also trying to upsell into done-for-you versions, which is a service-based model, it sounds like you have conflicting goals here. And that's I'm trying to get. I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish, which makes it difficult for me. Dan, what do you have?
Well, I go to the last step, which is let's run 2 races. So we don't need to stop the service-based model to launch a product-based model. Let's do both, assuming that when you've gone through the process of evaluating the service-based model, that there's offer validation, that there's a market need, so on and so forth. Service-based models need to be at least in the middle of the innovation or diffusion of innovation curve. To be profitable. In other words, you're offering a service to fix an existing problem rather than trying to educate them on the problem and then solve it. So hard to be profitable and hard to build traction in a service-based business when there's not fairly wide awareness of the problem and the potential solution. So I would evaluate if your service is properly kind of aligned with the diffusion curve, and make adjustments accordingly. And that may solve the problem. If you're optimizing for cash in the short term, then fixing your service-based business is probably going to be the highest leverage. Mm-hmm. Longer term, service-based businesses are, unless you're going to do acquisition, typically not something that's going to have large multiple year-over-year growth, because they're relationship-based. It's hard to scale relationships. they're not transactional. You could scale transactions. It's hard to scale relationships. So really just, as you said, Nick, getting clear on kind of what is the longer term outcome, and then working backwards. If I were to, and because we did this, build out a product-based solution, like we have a app, is that I would work backwards from, realistically, that app or that product is a year from now. So how can I fund the production of that and build my audience around that product over the next year, such that the audience, like the cost of building the audience, is liquidated.
Yep.
So work backwards from that.
Part of the four lenses. Last thing, part of the four lenses is I would step back and say, if you're going product based, is there a way that developing these products also creates a time savings or a cost savings in providing the service?
Yeah. Cool.
Last one here. We'll hit this. I'm transitioning from mortgage industry to insurance, working to build cash flow. I have existing clients. What would you recommend the best way to announce this change?
Brian, are you completely out of the mortgage industry? So it's a complete shift, or are you going to be kind of running both races? Different messages depending on the outcome. If you're doing both, then it's, Nick, I would be curious what your thoughts are, but I'd probably start with, if I could solve these other problems, would you be interested? Mm-hmm. And then without saying that you're already doing it. Hey, if I was able to do X, Y, Z, help you with your property casualty insurance, or what specific type of insurance that you're focused in. But if I could solve these problems, would you be interested? And then bucket them. Okay, are you going to be interested? Okay, you say you're interested. Then that's the first micro step. Then the next micro step would be, if you are interested, how soon? Like, when would you like this problem to be solved? Because I think we misconstrue someone being interested with them wanting to take action now, which is a disaggregation between the knowledge cycle, like when are they shopping versus when are they buying? Because some people are shopping and buying at the same time, and some people are shopping for a long time before they buy. Like, I just want to collect a bunch of information, but we assume because someone is interested that they also want to buy now. Yep. So first, I would want to bucket them into: are you, if I could help you solve this problem, would you be interested? And then, yes, okay. Then within the folks who they would be interested, when are you looking to have this problem solved? And then based off that answer, then I would, those people who are looking to solve the problem now, then I would tell them what you're doing. Sounds like you're completely closing out loans.
The best thing, because I gotta jump here, just piggybacking off Dan, it's a power offer of sorts, exactly what he said. Because you could still use, hey, all of my old clients, everybody I talk to is running into this problem or having a hard time finding this or whatever. If I offer to do that for you and the benefits were XYZ, would you be interested? And then you just have conversations from there.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone. Hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow for Q&A, which is just open game. We just talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. So yep. Not really any topic off the table.
Anything left over from today or Monday or last Friday, just bring it to Wednesday and we'll break it down and have a conversation.
Cool. All right. Thanks.